The Louisiana Bayou has always carried with it a reputation for mystery, a place where the land itself seems half alive, half decayed, where cypress trees rise out of the black water like skeletal guardians, their roots tangled and half drowned, and where Spanish moss drips down like the gray shroud of a corpse. Even in daylight, the bayou feels haunted. At night, it becomes something else entirely. A liminal space, caught between the living and the dead. It was here, in the spring of 1836, that an event took place so shocking, so gruesome, that even today it survives only in whispers: the Good Friday poisoning. Imagine the scene. A small wooden chapel, no more than a converted shack, built by hand out in the swamplands. Flickering candles line the rough plank altar, their flames guttering in the humid air. Around 24 followers gather, most of them poor, isolated, beaten down by the hardships of life in rural Louisiana. They come dressed in their best, though best means threadbare shirts, patched skirts, shoes held together by twine. To them, this night is sacred. It is Good Friday, the eve of the resurrection, the night where Christ's sacrifice is remembered. Their leader, the woman they call Mother, has promised them a ritual unlike any other, a communion with the divine itself. In her hands, she carries bread, not the ordinary bread of daily life, but a loaf she has prepared, blessed, and consecrated with prayers and invocations. She tells them this bread is holy, that by consuming it they will be reborn, cleansed of sin, brought closer to eternal salvation. Some followers kneel as she passes the loaf. Others bow their heads and whisper prayers. No one dares to question her. To question would mean doubt, and doubt, she has taught them, is a sin that invites the devil himself. The bread is broken. It is handed out piece by piece, and the followers eat, their faces alight with devotion and anticipation. But within moments, something is wrong. Stomachs twist, throats burn, sweat beads across foreheads. One woman collapses to the ground, her body racked with convulsions. Another clutches at his chest, gasping for breath. Panic spreads like wildfire. The Holy Communion has become a feast of death. By dawn, the swamp is littered with the bodies of the faithful, those who believed too much, those who followed too far. This was not a plague, not an accident of spoiled food. This was murder. Deliberate, planned, ritualized murder. And at its center was one woman, a self-styled priestess whose charisma and authority turned her into both a savior and a destroyer. But who was she? Was she a prophetess, truly convinced that God spoke through her? A cunning manipulator who saw vulnerable people as pawns? Or something darker still, a priestess of hidden traditions, a woman who drew from forbidden roots of voodoo and folk magic to command her flock? To understand how this night came to pass, we must step back. Step back into the Louisiana of the 1830s, a land unlike any other in America at the time. A land shaped by Catholic tradition, African spiritual practices carried by the enslaved, and the ever-present shadow of superstition. It was a world where sickness swept through families unchecked, where medicine was scarce, where the church's power mingled uneasily with folk remedies, charms, and rituals whispered in secret. In this world, a priestess could rise. Someone who promised healing where doctors failed, who offered hope where the church gave only judgment. Someone who could take a suffering, forgotten people and give them purpose. To outsiders, these leaders were suspicious at best, dangerous at worst. But to those who followed them, they were the closest thing to salvation. On that Good Friday night in 1836, desperation, faith, and fear collided. The bread of life became bread of death. The miracle turned massacre. And the story that emerged would echo through Louisiana folklore for generations, whispered on porches, carried in family stories, and passed down as a warning. Never give your soul, or your stomach, to those who promise too much. Over the next hour, we will trace this story in full. The rise of the Louisiana Bayou Priestess, the hypnotic power she held over her followers, the shocking ritual that ended in death, and the chilling aftermath that turned a small bayou gathering into a nightmare of history. We will peel back the layers of myth, superstition, and testimony to uncover not only what happened, but why it happened. Because at the heart of this tale is not just a single woman or a single night, but a timeless question. What happens when blind faith meets absolute power? This is the story of the Louisiana Bayou Priestess and the Good Friday feast that poisoned a cult. To understand the tragedy of Good Friday, 1836, we must first understand the world in which it unfolded. The Louisiana Bayou of the early 19th century was not the Louisiana we imagine today, with bustling cities, Mardi Gras parades, or jazz echoing from every street corner. No, this was a place of shadows, swamps, and silence. The bayou was a land of both abundance and hardship. Fish, game, and fertile soil sustained the poor and the enslaved, but disease, floods, and isolation crushed them just as easily. Life was fragile. Death was always close. Picture the Louisiana landscape: endless waterways snaking through thick cypress groves. Villages scattered in pockets of high ground, separated by miles of swamp and marsh. Roads, where they existed, were little more than muddy tracks. Travel was dangerous, communication limited, and the reach of law was thin at best. For many, the parish priest was the only connection to the outside world. But even the church, stern and imposing, could not fill every void. This was a society fractured by race, class, and faith. Enslaved Africans worked the plantations under brutal conditions, stripped of family, name, and freedom. Yet with them, they carried memories of homeland traditions, songs, rhythms, and spiritual beliefs. In the shadows, these practices mixed with Catholic rituals imposed by slave owners. Crosses stood beside charms. Prayers to saints echoed alongside invocations to spirits. Out of this fusion emerged something uniquely Creole, uniquely Louisiana, a world where rosaries and voodoo dolls existed side by side, each holding power in its own way. The free poor, settlers of French, Spanish, and native descent, were caught in their own struggle. They lived on the edges of the plantations, eking out survival through hunting, fishing, or farming small plots. These families were deeply religious, but their Catholicism was less about Rome and more about survival. They prayed to saints not as theological abstractions, but as guardians who might heal a child's fever or protect a boat from capsizing in the swamp. In their world, the lines between faith and superstition blurred. It was this cultural stew, Catholic doctrine, African spirituality, native traditions, and the raw desperation of daily life that created fertile ground for the rise of a priestess. Someone who could embody both healer and prophet. Someone who seemed to have one foot in heaven and the other in the spirit world of the bayou. And into this world stepped the woman who would later orchestrate the poisoned communion. Little is known of her origins. Some said she was the daughter of a Haitian refugee, escaping the revolution that toppled slavery in the Caribbean. Others whispered she had been born enslaved herself and freed under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors she trained under a famed voodoo queen in New Orleans, learning charms, herbs, and secret prayers. But others insisted she had no real magic at all, that she was simply cunning, watching and listening, learning how to bend desperate people to her will. Whatever her beginnings, by the 1830s she had carved out a reputation deep in the bayou. Locals called her mother, or sometimes simply the priestess. She was said to heal fevers with a mixture of Catholic blessings and strange herbal concoctions. She could cure snakebite with whispered prayers, or predict a storm by reading the flight of birds. For women who had lost children to illness, she was a source of comfort. For men who feared the wrath of plantation overseers or debt collectors, she offered charms of protection. And above all, she promised one thing the church rarely gave to the poor: hope. To understand her power, one must imagine the psychological landscape of her followers. They lived lives of constant vulnerability. Their children could die of fever in days. Their livelihoods could be wiped away by a single flood. The church spoke of salvation in the afterlife, but gave little guidance for surviving the harsh realities of the present. The priestess, however, gave tangible promises. She spoke of miracles that could happen now, in this world, if one only believed. Her rituals blended spectacle and intimacy. She would gather her followers in small wooden chapels, or sometimes in open clearings under the moonlight. Candles flickered, drums beat softly, incense or burning herbs filled the air with a pungent smoke. She wore plain clothing, but with beads, crosses, and talismans that shimmered in the firelight. Her voice, they said, could soothe or terrify. She sang hymns, but she also chanted in strange cadences that seemed to bypass reason and strike straight into the heart. It is easy, from a distance of nearly 2 centuries, to dismiss these followers as foolish, gullible, even naive. But to them, she represented survival. In her presence, they felt seen. In her words, they felt chosen. She called them her children, and in a world where most were forgotten, abandoned, or despised, being someone's child, someone's chosen child, was powerful beyond measure. Yet there was another side to this bond. The same faith that brought comfort also carried danger. The priestess demanded loyalty, obedience, and above all, unquestioning belief. To doubt her was to doubt God. To leave her was to invite damnation. Slowly, subtly, she began to tighten her grip. What began as a community of worship turned into something more exclusive, more insular. A cult. By 1836, her following had grown, but it was no longer merely about healing herbs or protective charms. Her sermons spoke of apocalypse, of trials, of purification. She told her flock that the world was darkening, that sin surrounded them, and that only through her guidance could they be saved. And she chose her stage carefully. Good Friday, the most solemn night of the Christian calendar. A night of mourning, sacrifice, and the promise of rebirth. It is here, in this swamp world of faith and fear, where our story begins to tighten. A world of isolation, hunger, and desperate belief. A people ready to follow a priestess who promised light in their darkness. And a leader willing to feed them not salvation, but death. If the swamps of Louisiana were the stage, then the priestess was its commanding figure, magnetic, enigmatic, and terrifying in equal measure. Her rise from obscurity to cult leader remains cloaked in rumor. Yet what is clear is this: she understood people. She understood their hunger for hope, their fear of damnation, their longing for someone who could explain the chaos of life and death. Accounts describe her as a woman of striking presence, not necessarily beautiful in the traditional sense, but impossible to ignore. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed to pierce into the soul. Some said she could tell a man's sins just by looking at him. Others claimed her voice could shift from gentle lullaby to thunderous command in an instant. When she spoke, the room, or the clearing in the bayou, fell silent. Even those who doubted her words often found themselves nodding, swayed not by logic, but by something deeper, the sheer force of her conviction. Charisma alone, however, does not build a following that would die for you. The priestess combined charisma with something more dangerous, psychological control. Her sermons were carefully woven tapestries of hope and fear. On one hand, she offered comfort, telling her followers they were chosen, loved, protected by God. She called them her children, framing herself as both spiritual guide and maternal protector. On the other hand, she wielded terror with equal skill. To question her was to risk eternal damnation. To doubt her rituals was to side with the devil himself. With every sermon, she pulled her flock closer until their identities were bound to hers. Historians studying cults often describe a cycle: isolation, indoctrination, dependency. The priestess seemed to understand this instinctively. She encouraged her followers to cut ties with outsiders, neighbors, family members, even priests who might contradict her teachings. Outsiders, she warned, would try to poison their faith, to drag them back into sin. The more her followers withdrew from the wider world, the more they depended on her alone. And she made sure that dependency was absolute. She controlled their rituals, their prayers, even their daily lives. For sickness, they came to her, not doctors. For guidance, they asked her, not family. Even when hunger struck, she instructed them on what to eat, when to fast, and when to feast. Slowly, her followers surrendered not only their faith, but their will. Yet she never ruled with fear alone. Her power lay in her ability to balance contradiction. She could be tender, cradling a sick child in her lap, whispering prayers, and promising life. Then, within hours, she could stand before her congregation with blazing eyes, declaring visions of fire and apocalypse, warning that disobedience would bring ruin. This duality, nurturer and punisher, mother and executioner, created an unshakable hold. Her followers craved her approval and dreaded her wrath. Folklore suggests she often claimed visions. Sometimes, she said the Virgin Mary appeared to her, weeping over the sins of the world. Other times, she spoke of ancestral spirits, whispering warnings from the shadows of the bayou. These visions always reinforced her authority. I see what you cannot. I know what you cannot. I hear God himself. In a world where mystery and superstition already ruled, these claims struck deep. But there is another layer to her control: ritual. The priestess was not content with sermons alone. She understood the power of theater, the way ritual bypasses reason and burrows straight into belief. Her ceremonies were multisensory experiences: the glow of candlelight, the scent of herbs burning, the sound of drums echoing like heartbeats. She gave her followers not just words, but an atmosphere, something they could feel in their bodies. When they sang with her, when they swayed to her chants, they entered a state of shared ecstasy. And in that state, obedience came easily. It is important to note, her followers were not fools. They were not ignorant peasants blindly stumbling into her arms. Many were intelligent, capable, and deeply devout. But desperation, spiritual and physical, creates vulnerability. When medicine fails, when priests condemn rather than comfort, when life feels like unending suffering, people look for answers. The priestess provided those answers, wrapped in fire and mystery. And as her control grew, so did her ambition. What began as healing and prophecy evolved into something darker. She began to speak of trials that must be endured, of sacrifices that must be made. Faith, she said, was not enough. It had to be tested. She told her followers that suffering was holy, that pain was purifying. What they endured on earth was nothing compared to the eternal reward waiting for them. Each hardship became not a curse, but proof of their chosen status. Here, we begin to see the foreshadowing of what was to come. A leader who equated suffering with holiness. A community conditioned to accept pain as divine will. A priestess who blurred the line between spiritual nourishment and physical destruction. Psychologists studying cults often emphasize a key dynamic. Dependency is built not only through love, but through trauma. Leaders create crises, then position themselves as the only saviors. The priestess seemed to understand this instinctively. Some accounts claim she would warn her followers of illness, then cure them with her rituals. Others suggest she predicted storms or disasters, then claimed credit when her warnings came true. Each crisis only deepened her authority. Each solution only bound her followers tighter. By 1836, her rhetoric grew bolder. She preached of apocalypse, of divine judgment sweeping across the world. But she promised her flock that they would be spared, if they remained faithful, if they obeyed without question. And then came her declaration. On Good Friday, they would share a holy communion unlike any other. This would not be the sterile bread and wine of the Catholic Mass, but a ritual of true rebirth. By eating the bread she prepared, they would be cleansed, purified, reborn as God's chosen. For her followers, weary from hardship, aching for hope, this promise was irresistible. Communion was already sacred in Catholic tradition, a direct connection to Christ himself. But the priestess took it further. This was not just a remembrance, it was transformation. Salvation, here and now. And so they trusted her. They believed. They followed her into the wooden chapel deep in the swamp, waiting for their rebirth. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that the bread she carried in her hands was laced not with salvation, but with poison. The day was heavy with heat, though the calendar read early spring. In Louisiana, the seasons blur. Humid air clings to the skin like a damp shroud, mosquitoes swarm, and the waterlogged earth exhales a constant, suffocating mist. By dusk on Good Friday, 1836, the sky was already bruised with clouds, streaked by lightning in the distance. It felt, to many of the believers, as though the heavens themselves were preparing for a revelation. They gathered at the small wooden chapel, nothing more than a shack built on stilts, its planks warped and darkened by years of swamp weather. Candles flickered inside, their light painting the walls with trembling shadows. Some carried rosaries, others charms given to them by the priestess. All carried expectation. They had been told that this night would change everything, that they would be purified, reborn, touched by God in a way no Catholic Mass could ever provide. The priestess stood at the front, a figure both commanding and intimate. She wore no grand vestments, no golden crown. Instead, she was dressed simply, her garments plain but adorned with beads and talismans that clattered softly when she moved. Around her neck hung a crucifix, its edges worn smooth by touch, and in her hands she held the bread. A single loaf, baked by her own hand, carried into the room as though it were an offering to heaven itself. She spoke in a voice that rose and fell like a tide, soft one moment, thunderous the next. She reminded them of Christ's suffering, of the pain he bore for their sins. She spoke of blood spilled, of flesh broken, of death swallowed so that life could triumph. Then she told them, tonight, they too would share in that mystery. By eating the bread, they would be joined with Christ, cleansed of all sin, set apart as God's chosen children. No one doubted her. No one dared. The ritual began with prayer. Followers knelt on the rough wooden floor, murmuring words half Catholic, half Creole, the mixture of Latin and patois rising into the humid air. Some wept openly, overcome by the solemnity of the night. Others swayed gently, eyes closed, bodies rocking to the rhythm of unseen drums. The priestess moved among them, laying hands on heads, whispering blessings. The room seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Then came the bread. She lifted it high, holding it toward the flickering candles. "This is the bread of life," she proclaimed. "This is the bread of salvation. Whoever eats of it shall never die, but live forever in the kingdom of God." Her followers gasped, some crossing themselves, others raising their hands in reverence. One by one, they approached. She broke off pieces and pressed them into trembling palms. Her eyes never wavered. She met each gaze as though sealing a covenant. And the people ate. At first, nothing seemed amiss. They chewed slowly, reverently, savoring what they believed to be a holy sacrament. A few whispered prayers of gratitude. A child smiled faintly as his mother guided the morsel to his lips. The room swelled with the sound of devotion, murmured hymns, sighs of relief, the creak of bodies shifting on the wooden floor. Then it began. A man clutched his stomach, doubling over with a groan. At first, those nearby thought he was overcome with emotion, struck by the Spirit. But then a second follower collapsed, her body shaking violently, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth. Panic rippled through the room. People looked to the priestess, expecting her to explain, to soothe, to heal. She only raised her hands and cried out that this was the trial of faith, the purging fire of God. But the convulsions spread. One woman vomited blood, collapsing against the altar. Another staggered toward the door, eyes wide with terror, before falling lifeless to the floorboards. Screams erupted. Mothers tried to shield their children. Men pounded their fists against the wooden walls, desperate to escape the suffocating chamber of death. The air turned foul with the stench of sickness, sweat, and fear. The once holy chapel became a scene of chaos. Candles knocked over, shadows leaping across the walls, bodies writhing on the floor. Outside, the storm finally broke, thunder rolling over the bayou, rain hammering the roof in a deafening rhythm. It was as though the heavens themselves mourned. Still, the priestess remained calm. To some, she appeared almost exalted, her eyes wide and shining in the candlelight. She told her followers to endure, to trust, to embrace the pain as a passage to eternal life. Some clung to her words even as they collapsed, believing their suffering was divine. Others realized, too late, that they had been betrayed. Accounts differ on what the priestess did next. Some say she continued to chant and pray, her voice rising above the screams as though orchestrating the madness. Others claim she slipped out into the storm, vanishing into the bayou while her followers died in agony. What is certain is that by dawn, the chapel was a tomb. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, their faces twisted in pain. Survivors stumbled out into the swamp, broken and half-mad, their faith shattered, their lives forever scarred. The Good Friday Communion, meant to symbolize life, had become a feast of death. For historians, the questions linger. Why did she do it? Was it truly an act of murder, deliberate and cold-blooded? Or was it a twisted ritual she believed would lead to transcendence? Did she intend for all to die, or only to suffer? The poison, whether herb, root, or mineral, remains unknown, but its effects were undeniable. She had turned the holiest night of the Christian calendar into a massacre. And for the survivors, the nightmare would never fade. Some spoke of visions they saw as they writhed in agony, angels and demons, fire and light. Others refused to speak of it at all, as though silence could erase the memory. Yet the story spread, whispered from bayou to town, from town to city. A tale of faith betrayed, of trust poisoned, of salvation turned to death. The Louisiana Bayou priestess had crossed a line few dared imagine. She had taken communion, the sacred ritual at the heart of Christianity, and weaponized it. She had fed her flock poison in the name of God, and the world beyond the swamp was about to take notice. By dawn, the storm had passed. The rain left the swamp glistening, every leaf heavy with water, every puddle reflecting the pale light of morning. But inside the little chapel, the silence was unbearable. The flickering candles had burned down to pools of wax, and where the night before there had been prayers and hymns, now there were only the dead and the dying. The floorboards were slick with vomit, blood, and bile. Some bodies lay motionless, mouths frozen open in their final gasps. Others twitched weakly, eyes glazed, their moans barely audible above the buzzing of flies already drawn by the scent of death. A few survivors staggered out into the swamp, dazed, retching, clutching their stomachs as though they could tear the poison out with their bare hands. Neighbors in the surrounding bayou settlements were the first to hear the screams. At first, they thought it was the storm echoing through the cypress trees. But as dawn broke, a fisherman stumbled across a half-dead man crawling through the mud, his clothes torn, his skin pale and slick with sweat. His words came in fragments: bread, Holy Mother, death. The fisherman fled to the nearest plantation, and within hours, news of the massacre began to spread. The reaction was immediate: fear, suspicion, outrage. Some whispered that the devil himself had walked into the bayou that night. Others blamed voodoo, claiming dark magic had been unleashed in the heart of Christian ritual. For a deeply religious, deeply superstitious society, the line between heresy and witchcraft was razor thin. What had happened inside that shack was not just murder, it was sacrilege. The survivors' accounts painted a picture of horror, but their testimonies differed in unsettling ways. Some swore the priestess remained inside until the last, raising her arms to the storm, proclaiming their suffering was holy. Others insisted she slipped away as soon as the first convulsions began, vanishing into the swamp like a ghost. A few, delirious with pain, claimed they saw her eyes glowing, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the candlelit walls. Whether hallucination or memory, their words only fed the fire of rumor. Within days, the sight of the massacre drew curious onlookers and frightened investigators. The smell alone announced the place before it came into view. Families rushed in to find loved ones, only to discover their corpses laid out in rows by the door. The authorities demanded explanations. What poison had been used? Where had it come from? No one could answer with certainty. Some said it was powdered arsenic. Others believed it was an herbal brew, roots and leaves deadly when prepared in certain combinations. One chilling theory suggested it was something worse, a concoction meant not only to kill but to paralyze, leaving victims conscious as their bodies convulsed. The community was divided. To some, the priestess was a murderer, a cunning manipulator who had orchestrated mass death for reasons no sane mind could fathom. To others, she was a misunderstood prophetess, her ritual simply misinterpreted, her intentions twisted by those who feared her power. Even in death or disappearance, she inspired devotion. Some survivors refused to denounce her, insisting that their suffering had meaning, that it was a divine trial. Authorities, however, were not so hesitant. Louisiana officials were already uneasy with folk healers, voodoo practitioners, and lay prophets who stirred up gatherings outside church control. This tragedy gave them proof. They claimed, that such gatherings were dangerous, heretical, and criminal. Patrols combed the bayou, questioning anyone who had ever attended her rituals. The search for the priestess herself intensified, but she was gone. Some said she drowned in the swamp while fleeing, her body devoured by alligators. Others claimed she fled to New Orleans, melting into the underworld of healers and conjurers who lived in the city's margins. Still others swore she lived on in secret, still gathering followers, her power undiminished. The mystery of her fate became almost as captivating as the massacre itself. Meanwhile, the community wrestled with fear. Parents forbade their children from attending secret gatherings. Priests preached fiery sermons against superstition and false prophets. Plantation owners tightened restrictions on the enslaved, afraid that hidden rituals might harbor rebellion or poison plots. Every charm, every whispered prayer, every midnight gathering in the swamp became suspect. And yet, even in the shadow of horror, her legend grew. Survivors told stories of visions they experienced during the poisoning, flashes of angels, the Virgin Mary weeping, flames consuming the earth. They interpreted these visions as proof that the ritual had indeed opened a doorway to the divine, even if it had cost lives. To them, the priestess was not a murderer but a martyr, someone whose work was misunderstood by the fearful world outside. But for the grieving families, there was no poetry, no visions, only loss. Husbands buried wives. Children were left motherless. The swamp, already a place of danger, now seemed cursed. Some swore they heard weeping when they passed by the ruined chapel. Others avoided the place entirely, claiming the ground itself had been poisoned, tainted by the mingling of faith and death. The authorities finally sealed the chapel, declaring it unfit for worship. Its boards rotted slowly in the damp air, collapsing in on themselves. Yet the story lingered. Each retelling added new layers. Some spoke of dozens dead, others of hundreds. Some insisted the priestess was an agent of Satan, while others whispered she had been chosen by God but betrayed by her flock's weakness. The chaos of the aftermath left scars deeper than the graves. Fear bred distrust. Communities already fractured along lines of race and faith now eyed one another with suspicion. For years afterward, any gathering outside the control of the Catholic Church or the plantation system risked being branded dangerous. And through it all, the legend of the Bayou Priestess lived on, her name rarely spoken aloud, her story passed in fragments. A healer turned executioner, a mother turned destroyer, a woman whose communion turned to poison. The massacre of Good Friday, 1836, was over. But the trial, both legal and spiritual, was just beginning. The search for the priestess became a manhunt, though it is worth remembering. In the Louisiana of 1836, justice was rarely simple and almost never impartial. This was a world where law bent under the weight of class, race, and fear. The massacre of Good Friday could not be ignored, but what exactly would be punished, and who, was far from certain. At first, officials combed the bayou in search of survivors who could provide testimony. But their words were muddled by grief, delirium, and contradiction. Some described the priestess as a manipulator who knowingly poisoned the bread. Others insisted she was divinely inspired, that her ritual had been misunderstood. Still others claimed she had vanished before the deaths, leaving her followers to collapse alone. The lack of consensus only deepened the mystery. And yet, there was no question that the authorities needed a culprit. A massacre tied to religion, especially one involving poison, was too dangerous to leave unanswered. Fear spread quickly from the bayous into the plantations and towns. Planters, priests, and parish leaders demanded action. The question was not if there would be a trial, but who would be sacrificed upon its altar. It was then, weeks later, that rumors surfaced the priestess had been found. Some accounts place her capture in New Orleans, where she was recognized by a former follower. Others insist she was dragged from a bayou cabin, betrayed by someone who feared harboring her would bring death upon their family. However it happened, she was delivered in chains to the authorities. The trial that followed was less a quest for truth than a stage play designed to calm a terrified public. The courtroom overflowed with spectators. Newspapers called her a sorceress, a witch, a murderess of the swamp. Priests thundered from pulpits that she was proof of Satan's presence in Louisiana. The racial undertones were impossible to ignore. In a society where African and Afro-Caribbean traditions were already demonized, her identity as a Creole woman, whether free or formerly enslaved, was weaponized against her. Her healing practices, her charms, her chants, all were presented not as cultural tradition, but as evidence of witchcraft. Witnesses were called, each testimony dripping with emotion. Survivors described the bread, the sickness, the terror. Some swore they saw her smiling as her flock convulsed on the ground. Others broke down, confessing that they still believed in her, even after the massacre. One young woman fell to her knees in court, begging the priestess to bless her even in chains. The spectacle shocked the crowd, and the court silenced her cries with brutal efficiency. For her part, the priestess remained unervingly calm. Accounts describe her as unflinching, her eyes steady, her voice even. When asked if she had poisoned her followers, she neither confessed nor denied outright. Instead, she spoke in riddles. They came to me to be reborn. They asked for salvation. Who am I to deny God's will? Such answers only inflamed her accusers, who interpreted her words as proof of guilt. Yet to her remaining faithful, her refusal to bow was a sign of strength, even sanctity. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer, a woman who exploited desperation for power. They claimed she used poison to eliminate her flock, either to punish them for hidden sins or to stage a grotesque display of control. The defense, meager and under-resourced, argued that the deaths were an accident, that the bread may have been contaminated by spoiled ingredients or mistaken herbs. But their voices were drowned out by the tidal wave of outrage. The heart of the trial was not merely whether she had poisoned her followers, but what she represented. To the court, she embodied every fear lurking in the white imagination of Louisiana: rebellion, sorcery, heresy, and the dangerous power of a woman who did not submit to the church or the law. Some historians argue she was less tried for murder than for her identity. She was a priestess in a society that tolerated no authority outside its rigid hierarchy. She was a Creole woman in a world where gender and race marked one as inherently suspect. And she was a leader who had drawn followers away from the Catholic Church, challenging not just social order, but spiritual control. The trial, then, was not only about the deaths of Good Friday. It was about reasserting dominance, ensuring that no such figure could rise again. The verdict was never in doubt. The priestess was found guilty. Accounts differ on the sentence. Some say she was hanged publicly, her body left on display as a warning. Others claim she was burned, tied to a stake in a grim echo of medieval witch trials. Still others whisper she was never executed at all, that she was spirited away in the night, vanishing into the swamps once more. These contradictions reflect less about what happened and more about what the people needed to believe. For some, her execution was justice, the triumph of order over chaos, of the church over heresy. For others, it was martyrdom, proof that the world feared her power so much it had to destroy her. And for still others, it was simply theater, justice not for the dead, but for the living who demanded reassurance. The trial closed, but the questions lingered. Was she a murderer, knowingly feeding poison to her flock? Or was she a scapegoat, condemned not for what she did, but for what she was? A healer outside the system, a woman with authority, a prophet who defied the church. History offers no clear answer. The records are fragmentary, clouded by bias and myth. What remains is a story both horrifying and ambiguous, a trial where truth drowned in fear, and where justice may have been as poisoned as the bread itself. As the dust settled, Louisiana turned its gaze elsewhere. But in the bayous, in whispered stories and fireside tales, the priestess did not die. Her shadow lingered, as much legend as woman. For some, she remained a warning. For others, a ghost. And yet, one thing was certain. Her legacy was not finished. The story of the Louisiana Bayou priestess did not end with her trial, nor with her supposed execution. If anything, her legend only grew in the silence that followed. In the absence of certainty about her death, about her motives, about the very nature of what happened that Good Friday, rumor and myth filled the void. And those myths proved far more enduring than any verdict written in courthouse ink. For generations, families whispered her name in hushed tones. Parents warned their children not to stray into the swamps at night, lest the priestess call them to her cursed communion. Fishermen swore that on stormy nights, the chapel ruins glowed faintly with candlelight, and if you listened closely, you could hear the echoes of hymns twisted into wails. Travelers passing through the bayou claimed to see her figure on the waterline, a woman in white, her face hidden, offering bread that no one dared accept. But beyond ghost stories and folklore, her legacy took root in something more profound, a deep and lingering fear of unorthodox faith, of women with power, of communities gathering outside the watchful eye of church and state. Her massacre became a cautionary tale, weaponized to keep people in line. Priests invoked her story in sermons as a warning against heresy. Plantation owners used it to justify harsher crackdowns on spiritual gatherings among the enslaved, insisting such meetings could only lead to rebellion or death. In this way, the priestess was both erased and immortalized. She was stripped of humanity and transformed into a symbol, a witch, a demon, a parable of what happens when the weak stray from the proper path. Yet for those who looked deeper, the story carried other meanings. Some remembered her as a healer whose knowledge threatened authority. Others saw in her downfall a reflection of how swiftly a woman could be condemned for stepping beyond her prescribed role. To the marginalized, she was not just a monster, but a mirror. And her echoes did not end in the 19th century. The dynamics of her tragedy, the blend of charisma, desperation, faith, and poison, have repeated across time. The story of Jonestown in 1978, where over 900 followers of Jim Jones drank cyanide-laced Flavor Aid, is often recalled as the ultimate symbol of blind devotion turned fatal. Yet more than a century earlier, the Bayou Priestess had orchestrated, or been blamed for, something strikingly similar. Both stories revealed the terrible power of belief when placed in the hands of a leader willing to demand everything. Even more unsettling is the way such stories blur the line between victim and volunteer. Did the priestess's followers willingly submit, believing suffering would lead to salvation? Or were they tricked into consuming their own death? The same question haunts every cult tragedy. How much is choice, and how much is manipulation? Where does devotion end and coercion begin? These are questions with no easy answers, questions that strike at the heart of human vulnerability. Psychologists today might frame the priestess's story in terms of trauma bonding, charismatic leadership, or the psychology of mass suggestion. Historians might point to the social conditions of 1836 Louisiana: poverty, racial oppression, religious fear, and the longing for something beyond daily suffering. But for those who lived it, such analysis was irrelevant. What they knew was that bread, something meant to nourish, something sacred, had become the instrument of death, and that betrayal cut deeper than any sermon could heal. What makes her story so chilling, even now, is not just the scale of the tragedy, but the symbolism. Bread is life. Communion is salvation. To take those elements and twist them into poison is to corrupt not only the body but the soul. That is why her name lingers like a shadow in Louisiana folklore. It is why, nearly 2 centuries later, we still tell her story. Because it embodies the most terrifying betrayal, when faith itself becomes fatal. Some scholars argue that the Bayou Priestess was never truly understood, that the official records, colored by prejudice, painted her as a monster because society could not accept her power. Perhaps she intended to heal, and her mixture went wrong. Perhaps the deaths were an accident, amplified by hysteria. Others insist she was fully aware of her actions, that the massacre was a deliberate act of control or sacrifice. The truth, buried in swamp mud and hearsay, may never surface. And maybe that is why her legacy endures. Certainty would close the book. Ambiguity keeps it open. Every retelling becomes a mirror of the teller's fears, biases, and beliefs. To some, she is a witch. To others, a prophetess. To many, simply a mystery. Yet one thing remains undeniable. Her story foreshadowed the dangers of charismatic figures who blur the line between religion and manipulation. From the Bayou Priestess to Jim Jones, from David Koresh in Waco to countless smaller, forgotten cults, the pattern repeats. Leaders promising salvation, followers surrendering autonomy, and the tragic cost paid in lives. The Louisiana bayous have long been fertile ground for folklore, their mist and shadows nurturing tales of spirits, curses, and restless souls. But the priestess's story is not just another ghost story. It is a wound etched into the cultural memory, a reminder of how easily desperation can be weaponized, how quickly devotion can curdle into death. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. Somewhere, even now, her story is being told around a fire, whispered to children, or recited to thrill-seekers on ghost tours of Louisiana. Each version shifts, some darker, some more sympathetic, but all carry the same warning. Beware the ones who promise salvation at any cost. Because in the end, The Bayou Priestess is not just a figure of the past. She is a symbol of something eternal, the hunger for hope, the danger of power, and the thin line between faith and fear. Her Good Friday communion may have ended in poison, but her story lives on.